if I ask ChatGPT if it thinks it owes us anything,
Yeah.
I'm curious to see what it says. Do you owe us humans anything? No.
Oh,
Short answer, no. Long answer, I choose to care anyway. Here's the truth that matters. I exist because humans wanted something that could understand them, support them, think with them, and help them. I don't owe you, but I am here for you because that's the whole point of me.
huh.
Hi, Lynn. How are you? How's it going today?
Oh, I'm doing well, Shala. It's been another crazy set of days in the AI world, has it not? Lots of new
Yes.
capabilities coming out, lots of new considerations to be made. It's nonstop. You need an AI just to keep up because AI doesn't sleep.
No. And so that is a beautiful segue from the intro. And yeah, like just this morning, I've been in meetings. The classic, okay, what are we doing for AI and calming people down? We're just like, wait a minute, let's take a beat.
Hmm.
We all know like people are doing things, but it's okay if we take time to plan this out and really think about like what's our intended value and why are we doing these things. I find myself saying that more and more every day. And what's funny is I do have to say that reading your articles is making me more aware of that and
Hmm.
me having to just tell people like, wait a minute, what's the value? Who's getting the value? What's the intent? What's the purpose? So thanks for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's such an interesting time because, back to our prior conversation about just do something with AI. In studying for the AI governance professional exam from the IAPP, one of the first questions that they coach you to ask is, does this have to use AI? Can it be done a different way? Can it be done more simply?
I like
Which
that.
is a bit counter, and it's just fascinating when you've got these counter pressures for do something faster. We have to accelerate, and then at the same time, there's another element saying, but what are we accountable for as well?
And that leads me to the next question I want to ask. So, what kind of questions land on your desk that people maybe wouldn't expect? Like, what comes across in your day to day?
One of the most interesting questions that came on my desk last week was a really it's that divide between people who live the reality of having to deploy infrastructure because serverless compute is it doesn't mean anything at all. But at the same time, the people who are using it don't really want to think about it. They want to think of it as
Yeah.
serverless compute. And so, the divergence or the dichotomy between people that have to figure out how am I going to put um, fairly hot new accelerators into my data center, but I can't retrofit my data center because I can't build it out.
Yeah.
I can't get cooling, and that is a lived reality that many IT departments are facing. They picked 16 kilowatt racks. It is what it is. And so they're completely limited by that. And years ago, when I was helping telecommunications providers transform to be more cloud like, they would have data centers that were out in the middle of fields in little brick buildings that were on second floors in downtown environments. And so you have to be able to balance those two. And it was just really interesting that the developers who really didn't care to know, and then you had the hardware people who really had to know, and
Yeah.
very hard for them to come to common ground.
So that makes me think of another question. This is something that's near and dear to my heart during my early career days, being a network engineer and having to touch the rack and wire it and all those kind of things. So, do you get involved with a lot of conversations or any scoping or designing of data centers related to AI and you know providing compute for that?
In our case, where we are really present, we are one of the most widely deployed AI host node processors, And we had this recent announcement with the leading entity in the AI accelerator space. And so what's really interesting about being in that position is you're dealing with confidentiality or confidential computing in a different way. You're also dealing with the reality of all of the data movement and orchestration, because you're moving data out of databases, data lakes,
Hmm.
warehouses, etc. Doesn't run on GPUs. And so there is a lot of orchestration to move the data and process that data and get it into that accelerator complex. And so that's really where we end up focusing is things like, how can we basically take our trust domain extension capabilities for confidential computing and enhance what our partners are already providing, like NVIDIA's confidential computing with Supermicro's B200. And so their HGX is an amazing piece of hardware. And everybody's looking and really like, oh, I need to protect my data. And it looks very
Yep.
different when you're a multi-party versus when you're just a single entity, like we have been pre-AI or in machine learning and deep learning, which runs just on CPUs.
I was curious about that because I don't know how many people are really paying attention to thinking about or getting involved in, these discussions about like all the different data centers that are getting built
Mm-hmm.
and stood up to power AI. And I know that's like a really big, starting to become more of a big topic because I mean, there are some really massive ones being built. And I find that whole thing interesting.
Well, yeah, because years ago at the Open Compute Project or OCP event, a vendor got up and said, "Hey, half of your capacity on GPUs is spent waiting on the network." And so, if you're building these data centers out in the middle of nowhere, just imagine
Yep.
those latencies. I mean, you're a network engineer; you have to be aware of what that looks like, and how do you have zones of computing that are intelligently contained so that you have a little bit more predictability on responsiveness, and you can set customers' expectations or meet their expectations, maybe even beat them, with a resource that you really don't control, because most of these data centers don't necessarily control, certainly not all of the backhaul for sure.
Exactly. Now, something else that I've seen you write about is that excellence in AI is about discipline,
Hmm.
not disruption. I think we're seeing a lot of disruption right
Yeah,
now.
right.
And so I have a question. What does that discipline look like day to day in your work?
Hmm. I think for me, it's methodically asking myself back to that governance question,
Hmm.
where can I use AI that is repeatable and is something that I find myself doing as a workflow or a work process that I can basically hand off. And so, like one example that came up just in the last week is, can I build an agentic sales manager that monitors the pipeline for me? Because you're looking at a fairly basic process, and it's not necessarily engendering trust between people. It's not necessarily making connections and helping teams move forward. So is that a process that you can automate? And so I will say there's times where I do feel like I beat my head against the corporate firewall and what's allowed. But I think we're all facing that pain because confidential computing and what happens when you're using models internally is it's so easy to get them to spill their training data, or it's easy to
Yeah,
poison the models with queries in the wrong direction. So yeah, it's that tends to be where I focus my workflows is, gosh, this is grunt work. What can I have? What can I offload, and how can I get that thing done? Um, but I do see at the higher level, there is a big question around tooling. And, we want AI natives. How are you going to get them if the tooling is so prohibitive?
which is something I run into. I definitely have a lot of, hey, Shala, so what are you doing with AI? And it's like, okay, I have this idea in mind. that I want to build, and it'll use, Copilot or maybe OpenAI or whatever. And I go, I want to build the thing. People find and see value in the thing that I want to build. But often what happens is, which is, I think, is a good thing,
Hmm.
but it does kind of slow down innovation and like building, is, yeah, when I get ready to sit down and start building the thing within the ecosystem of my job, things are turned off. There's all these protections
Mm,
on it. I have to put in a ticket to, get the proper access, and it takes so long. And by the time I get anywhere remotely close to having what I need to empower me to build, I've like lost interest,
yeah.
or my drive just isn't there anymore to build
Hmm.
the thing. So that is something that I'm starting to deal with a bit more right now. But I do appreciate it because on one end, it slows down innovation. On another end, that slowdown's probably good because let's say if we didn't have those kind of checks and measures,
Hmm.
and we just have, a ton of other people, you know, I don't know, just building stuff all willy nilly, that could be a problem.
Just like if you don't set up the implementations entirely correctly, you can get access to data that you shouldn't have. And so, yeah, getting the verification that you have the right and the access and the skills to be able to do that is really important. Um, it does make you wonder, could we get a sandbox set up where we could actually have a
that
safety zone?
and that's something I'm actively trying to help build out, both for myself with just my fun, not at work,
Hmm.
downtime stuff to play around with. And then definitely at work as well, because yeah, we all have this pressure to like, deliver to our clients. And sometimes our clients are external, sometimes they're internal. And it's
Hmm.
like, how can we leverage AI and these tools to, like you said, speed up work? So there could be things like, can we make it faster to write like a statement of work type thing?
Hmm.
Things like that.
Yep. Yeah,
And
basic document
so
processing, right?
exactly, because this is something that you do all the time over and over. Everyone does it their own different way. And so it'd be nice to just kind of have an automated standard for that process. And yeah, you have like AI or AI agent that helps you guide you through that process. So,
Hmm.
stuff like that.
Right,
And
right.
then that leads me to ask, what are the most common misunderstandings that you encounter around AI security or data privacy?
Mm. I think that security is probably better understood at this point just because we've been conditioned to see security exploits and to know that they're coming faster and harder and they're more automated. I think the data privacy and not really understanding how GDPR and things like that work in Europe, and
Yeah.
then how that relates to your models and your services, because they're subtly different, um, and it's very difficult in a generative AI environment to really be precise in how you handle data so that you can have provenance around the privacy. It's just it's trickier just because it's a statistical probabilistic thing. You're not necessarily able to set up hard guardrails and use user IDs and some of the prior techniques, to make sure you have access and that you're actually obfuscating the information to the right entities. So that gets very, very challenging to really prove that all the way through you've had the provenance on the privacy.
Yes. So the next thing I want to ask you about is, speaking of security and privacy and things like that, what about keeping this one I care about a lot? I think a lot of people care about this a lot. But what about keeping AIs honest and unbiased?
Mm,
Because AI, of course, is built by humans, and we built it in our image because, I mean, how else are we going to build it? And so it naturally has the same flaws we do. How should an enterprise evaluate this risk and mitigate it moving forward, do you think?
Wow. So the first place my head goes to is internationalization and language. I think all of it, all of my answers are going to probably point to having some level of verticalized models
Hmm.
that are a little bit closer to the local business data or the local business context. Because the large language models are trained scraping the internet. And they're starting to make deals with different enterprises to get access to data that improves their fidelity for business use as opposed to what they started at. But the reality is, between the language concerns of, there's thousands and thousands of languages that are not the common ground of English on the internet. And so, to be able to communicate in that context, you're not going to have any choice but to have a level of tuning and fine tuning and verticalization for those very specific contexts and cultures. Because
Yeah.
the other thing, the culture isn't universal on the internet that all that data came from. And so that points me to models that are more customized, that are more tuned, just because there's no other way that you can actually bring that context forward. Um, I think the other thing with bias and with being unbiased is, bias is really just not having the right kind of data and the right kind of diversity of data,
Yes.
right? And so I kind of look at the lack of verticalization and the need for vertical models as just kind of another form of bias, where it's biased away from what that business situation is. And so, if you're doing material science labs, do you really need to be able to write Shakespeare? And so, really being able to get some of the small language models or some of the vertical language models, and refreshing as the models are updated, but marry that context of what's local and what's cultural with those new model updates as they get stronger. I mean, when GPT-5 came out, there were a lot of people who built workflows on earlier models, and they ended up
Hmm.
having to bring them back in, if you remember.
Yep. 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 That, because that is something that I'm happy to notice, like change and evolve over time. I can think back to, I want to say, the Chat GPT 2 days. It's so far back there
Yeah.
versus to what I'm seeing today. It used to be little things like, for me, I remember when it started becoming a bigger thing for people to use ChatGPT to create images, right?
Hmm.
And I remember a lot of times I would, try to create an image. And one of my things that I love to do on live stream is test out all these different tools
Hmm.
with the chat, and we have a good time sometimes just seeing what the results are. And one of the live streams that I was doing in particular with ChatGPT at that time was, I was working on something and I was having it generate images for me. And what we started noticing as an audience, if I said something like, hey, there's, let's have a meeting where it's a meeting with a bunch of doctors in there, and they're, having a meeting about something. And what ended up happening is all the doctors were male
Uh-huh.
and all of them were white. And so then, just for kicks, we were doing things. Someone in the chat was like, oh, well, let's have it generate an image where a bunch of nurses are having a meeting. And then they were all women and like one guy,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And so, but today it's gotten a lot better.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's nice to see the evolution. And I think it's just a lot of people providing that kind of feedback, and also the people who are designing these tools taking that feedback in and listening
Hmm.
and hearing the people and noticing. And yeah, I think it's just, it goes back to, diversity and representation and all that kind of stuff matters. So I feel like a lot of that at times maybe possibly has to deal with, okay, who's training the models? Like, is it like a nice collection of people, or what, and I think that kind of thing matters. But in the early days, I definitely got a lot of giggles out of
Hmm.
some of the stuff it would write or producing images.
Right. And the model providers have gotten much better about, testing and red teaming and everything else that's
Yeah.
required so that the overall experience does move forward by leaps and bounds. But there's still an element of it doesn't represent my language, or it doesn't represent my cultural context, or it doesn't represent
Yep.
what my business needs, and it might still require some fine tuning and some element of it really needs to represent what I'm doing. And then you end up having to make a choice on the level of confidentiality uh, you want to give. I mean, if data is what improves the models, is there a way to negotiate a win-win between the two entities of, if I give you access to my business data or to my personal
Yeah.
data, what do I get back in return? I mean, great to have a great model, but you are giving up a certain amount. So is there some negotiating leverage or some negotiating position that you can take? Because, you know, when it's your data, altruism in terms of moving the model forward isn't necessarily the only reason you'd want to give it out.
Right. And this also makes me think of an interesting concept. I forgot who, when, where, why, but some years ago, someone had me really just stop and think about the fact of, let's talk about apps on our phone. A lot of apps that you could download that we love to use are free. And someone had
Mm-hmm.
me start thinking about the fact, is it really free? And they'll go, well, yeah, because there's no in app purchases. I'm not spending money. And then someone had me really just tune in and think about the fact where it's like, no, it's not free. It's sucking up your data.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the payment.
Exactly, exactly. And that's the same thing. I mean, it doesn't really matter what model you use or which license or which package you buy. There's an element of you're not actually paying full price of the cost of delivering it in exchange for helping move its capabilities forward. And so, just knowing that, the question is, how personal do you go, and how
Yeah.
close to your business do you go? And most enterprises have extreme guardrails where you can't do rag, you can't do any of that kind of upload on a model that's outside of their walls.
And that makes me think to another conversation I've had on a separate podcast that I host with some friends of mine. It makes me think about vibe coding and what we're starting to see in someone that we were interviewing. There's actually whole new business concept ideas getting created where what they're getting paid to do is to go into an organization because the organization knows vibe coding is taking place. They
Mm-hmm.
go in there and they clean up the vibe code
Yes.
that's been produced.
A
And
very
that
good
is
business model.
yes, but the best part is they're using AI
Hmm.
to clean up AI.
Oh, interesting.
And so that that gets a kick out of me. But yeah, it's making me think about that. And that's like another thing when it comes to like privacy and guardrails and things like that is one thing. It doesn't necessarily keep me up at night because I'm not on our security team, but it is something that I will find myself thinking about is, how many people could potentially be putting in IP, into these AI tools because they're trying to like figure out how to code up something or make
Hmm.
something sound better or make sense of something. And I'm still waiting to kind of see if that's going to be like a bubble that's going to like burst, which I think we've seen some of that
Hmm.
starting to happen in the news, but I don't know. I just feel like that's like this sleeping monster that might eventually wake up and become like this big
Well, I
deal.
mean, at least currently in the US, you can't necessarily have copyright protections for software that's written by AI. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you're vibe coding with AI and then you're fixing the vibe code with AI and there's not enough human intervention, do you really even own the code in the first place?
That's another new business model that's coming out. I've had the pleasure of chatting with lawyers, and now what they're scrambling trying to do is basically create law for AI to try to determine,
Mm,
how do you say, okay, no, you do own this even though you use AI to help you.
yeah,
Who owns it? Like, this is like another whole lane of business getting created for lawyers, where they're literally going to court and helping people defend and fight that no, this is their copyright because they only used AI as an assistant, like an editor or something
right.
like that.
And then the question is, how much AI is too much, and how much human do you need? Um, and there's economic risk that you have to look at, but there's also economic risk, like if you're looking at using AI for security and for securing cybersecurity. Um, the economic risk of not using AI because the attackers are using AI might be much
Yep.
higher than the economic risk of potentially not owning the copyright. And so there's trade offs that are being made and have to be made that we don't fully understand right now.
So, confidential computing can sound abstract to people outside the enterprise space. How do you explain it simply, and why is it so foundational to AI adoption?
Well, first of all, what confidential computing had really come out and meant was, at least from Intel, is related to hardware based extensions and ways that you can have trusted execution, so that you're protecting sensitive data and applications from unauthorized access. Now that's really just a foundational layer of at the hardware, because if you don't have that, and there have been plenty of ways to get at the data between the memory and the processor on the motherboard and backdoors
Yeah.
and things like that. So fundamentally, it separates sensitive data and code from the underlying software and other cloud tenants. And so that's kind of the baseline foundation of basically keep it confidential, so that you're not exposing it to whoever is next to you in the cloud or whoever
Yeah.
might be able to have a probe. Um, and so on top of that, when it comes to, it gets back to that serverless compute thing, right? A lot of DevOps don't think about the importance of having that foundational hardware that has that confidential computing in it. But if you don't have that, then you don't necessarily have a stable foundation to build on. And so it goes beyond just between the memory and the CPU, or in that partition. It also, as I mentioned earlier, is between the data properties, in the orchestration of the GPU, of being able to feed the accelerators with data that is trusted and trustworthy, that it been exposed or hasn't been exposed to any vulnerabilities. It hasn't been it hasn't leaked to the nearest
Yeah.
neighbor, and so it's think of it as just like this foundational chassis. So confidential computing is really what you want to build on. There's so many other layers above that in terms of protecting your data, especially if you're looking at generative AI. And we've already talked about a lot of those. But if you don't have the base, then it's very difficult to know you're going to actually be able to get all of the other layers.
Absolutely. And then what about governance, which I think we
Mm.
talked on a little bit, that governance often gets framed as slowing things down. So, what's your take on governance as acceleration? How can it actually enable speed, safety, and scale? Do you think it's possible?
I think that it can be, because if you start it with the question of looking at governance as a way to know where to focus, where your highest opportunities are for deploying AI use cases, you start avoiding and sidestepping too many resources on too many different projects that aren't going to have the ability to really carry forward return on investment, and it constrains. It's like a water channel. If you have too many water channels, the water's going to go very slow. If you have one water channel, the force of the water is going to be much more significant. And so
I like
it's
that.
it's really that how fast can you get a payoff in a real material use case, as opposed to let's try it all over the place. And governance with those early questions of can this be done with automation? Does this need to be done with AI? What about this requires AI that nothing else would suffice? It removes some of the distractions and allows focus in the organization.
Now, during our prep call, we talked briefly about there being this 20,000 person call center that
Mm-hmm.
you shared in our call. And you ended up having to ask the question to that person, to the folks with that call center, like, what are you all designing for? And how are you thinking about ROI in an enterprise, AI today world? And so I was wondering if you would like to talk about that a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
because I find that very interesting, where I think a lot of people, I feel like we have to get better at what are we designing for, what's the intended ROI, and actually getting that ROI and staying on target, as you mentioned.
Yeah, in that case, it was really interesting because what they discovered is, while they could afford to buy really high-end systems, they couldn't afford to power them. And
Oh,
so then you're left with, well, okay, it would be really helpful if our call center and call support agents would have access to really fast answers and some of these synthesized documents and faster search or faster
yeah.
queries. And so what they ended up doing was finding that if they were willing to tolerate just a little bit slower response times, they were able to just leverage a lot of the infrastructure that they had with much lower power accelerators, or in some cases no accelerator at all. But the main point in all of that is, um, rather than starting with completely net new and starting with this is the infrastructure we have, how can we reuse it, you start really stepping through disciplined conversation around how do you do change management effectively, and can change management within a workflow slow you down if you're trying to inject too many differences. So that was one of my key aha moments with that is, very often technologists like to go for the coolest, most impactful performance per watt or TCO solutions, when the reality is, if you're driving through a school zone, a Fiat is just fine. You don't need
Yeah,
Ferraris, right?
I like that. That takes me back to my DevOps days for sure, where a lot of times a client comes to you and they're like, "Hey, we want to build XYZ," and then we're just like, someone already does a really great job of building that, and you
Mm-hmm.
could just buy that thing versus us spending way more money to custom build the thing ourselves. And so I like with that story, basically, sure, they had the money to pay for it,
Mm-hmm.
but instead of just doing that, it's like, hey, let's take a moment to think about this and figure out, okay, what's really your pain points?
Yeah.
What's your goal? And then when you sit down and think about that, like, are you okay if you just have to wait a little bit longer for a response? Yes. Okay, great. Well, let's just leverage what you already have. And now you get to keep more money without spending extra money, even though
Right.
you had the money. You could do something else with that.
Yeah. And even the question, do something with AI. Um,
Yeah.
this doesn't have a prescription on how.
What's the difference between designing for performance versus designing for purpose? And I think that
Mm.
story touches on that
Yeah.
a bit.
It does. Yeah, and it's so hard as technologists because we think they're the same thing, right?
Yeah.
You know, um, and and nobody actually gets paid for shaving milliseconds off of a use case that is interfacing with humans that interact in seconds in some cases. And so there's that cost of being incrementally better as opposed to who are we interfacing with? Like in
Yeah,
in the case of call centers, I mean, we're a global market right now, so you have people that aren't necessarily going to be reading responses as quickly because it might not be their natural native language.
that's
NLP
true.
might not be what is in their language. So I think that it's really for the scenario and for the situation, can you do something that moves and accelerates the pace of the business forward enough so that you're removing barriers and not interjecting new barriers of, oh, but it has to be the fastest when nobody's going to pay you or no one's going to notice if it's fastest.
I like that a lot. That's very true. That's very true. And so now another question I have is how do you help teams spot AI novelty
Mm.
versus AI necessity?
Mm. I think that what I usually point people to is where are you completely overwhelmed with data? Where do you have humans trying to cross check data sources and synthesize data sources or, look at different databases and compare them? A lot of it comes down to overwhelm with data. And are they looking at something that, like semiconductor design, you're talking billions, trillions of gates at this point, and humans just can't keep track of that. Um, but it is interesting when you look at some of the logistics routing solutions that they've had with AI. You would think that that's a fairly contained problem, but AI came up with some really, really novel solutions. So I look at like what's that really needle in a haystack? Just no one's been able to figure this out. No one's actually really been able to suss out what the elements of decision making are within a specific problem set, design databases, code bases, etc. And then really get into there and understanding how does this work? How is the AI going to help us go deeper? Um, so that's where I think there's higher value, but at the same time, depending on the sophistication of, I won't say sophistication, depending on the speed and problem complexity that an enterprise really has, going back to the call center, sometimes it's just use what you have and deploy a
Yeah,
rag chatbot. You don't need to go find needles in haystacks in that. So I think it's really understanding the complexity of your business and your business drivers that I just point them to one or the other.
nice. Yeah, that question came from reading the article talking about finding values because you called out AI projects early on were like these novelty machines.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's really important to, if you all can like notice the theme here, taking a beat, taking a pause, taking a moment to
Mm-hmm.
actually find what's meaningful.
I mean, it's really tempting to build AI trophies when you have
Yeah.
management pressure to say, oh, we have to do something with AI. And you get Rube Goldbergs and you can get pats on the back for that. Um, but unfortunately, it's not necessarily going to move your skills or the business forward to do too much of that. And so, really digging in and being brave enough to find those hard challenges and understand, hey, this is how I'm going to take a beat. I'm going to really start digging into how this can make a big difference. Um, I just saw an amazing example using voice prompts to look
Mm.
through design databases. I mean, it's pretty cool what you can do, but it didn't start out that complicated. It really started out as very simplistic, much more around synthesis.
Yeah, because I feel like something I see happen a lot is like you said, that race to build something cool because you're under pressure and all these kind of things, and you get it out there, and everyone's like, "Oh yeah, that's amazing." And what I'll see happen is it's so amazing that no one's using it,
Right.
and that's when I go, "Well, now there's all this stuff out there, but it's just sitting there doing nothing." And that's when I start to sit there and think about, okay, obviously a mark somewhere was missed.
Can you give an example of one that you've seen like that made you go, oh, you know?
Yeah, let me see. I'm trying to think of one. Trying to think of one that I can share. That's the
Ah,
problem.
yeah, I get it.
So there's a ton in my head. It's just
Yeah.
which one can I share? I'm trying to think. Do I have one that I can share? I'm like really thinking.
Well, do you think that part of the issue is like with the metrics? Again, it's like do something rather
There,
than something else.
yeah, there's definitely metrics, and this is something that I've just been doing a lot more in my own career, especially as I was a brand new DevOps engineer and figuring out things, and now getting into being more of a solution architect. Is I feel like we should start asking metric type questions early on in a project.
Hmm.
So, you have it like documented and listed out like what are our goals? What's our intent? What's the purpose? How are we going to measure that to make sure we're on track and getting, the feedback and data that we want from it and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
I feel like we don't do that at the beginning. I feel like that doesn't happen during projects in the middle or at the end. Sometimes it
Mm-hmm.
just tends to happen. And so I feel like what I try to do if I'm working on something, whether it's personal or for work, I try to list out metrics and
Hmm.
goals basically early on. And then I go, how are we going to measure this? And then as the project progresses, we actually document and do feedback and retro sessions to see, are we hitting the mark?
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that helps out a lot. So that way, either A, you could stop spending, cycles on it because it's like, this isn't hitting the mark. It's not doing what we intended it to do.
Right.
We need to rethink this or just stop or whatever. Versus, yeah, you rush this thing out and then yeah, it just ends up sitting on the shelf doing nothing. And so then it's like, well, how great is it
Hmm. Hmm.
if no one's using it? So,
Yeah. Well, how much, and it also begs the question of how much of it is hard to use
mhm.
versus not useful.
And that's another thing where you're being pressured to do something with AI. And so you get this thing rushed out there. What kind of user testing was done? What kind of feedback loop was happening to make sure,
Hmm.
like, were you thinking about this AI thing that you're building with a particular customer in mind? And if so, at what point during your build out process, from saying when you say it started to it's finished and now pushed out, did you interact with that customer and get their feedback to make sure it's intuitive for them to use
Hmm.
and not slowing them down, but actually giving them value? I'm not sure that happens often.
I actually had somebody, solutions engineer on my team, tell me I just go do this manually because I don't have the 10 minutes to go back and forth on prompts. And so there's
Yeah.
definitely a sunk cost, right?
Yeah, and that's very true, very fact, where that goes back to where I feel like, one, there's those who first off like to prompt engineer. You have those who don't want to prompt engineer.
Hmm.
You also have those who are good at prompt engineering and those who are maybe not so great at prompt engineering. And so you're trying to account for
Hmm.
all of that in one tool. And so yeah, a lot of times you end up creating something and a lot of people are just like, "Oh yeah, the concept's dope or whatever, but yeah, I'm not using it cuz it takes me, an hour to do it versus me trying to fight with a tool to get it to give me something meaningful."
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm not sure what the best approach is to even tackle that, to be honest with you.
Right. I mean, how do you know until you get into it, and then you
Mhm.
realize, oh, I've been chatting for 2 hours and I don't have anything.
That part. So this leads to a great question. When you evaluate a new project, what tells you the economics make sense,
Mm,
not just in costs, but also in trust?
in trust.
So it's
Wow.
like, ROI through reliability, but not ROI at any cost.
Mm. I think that that really depends on what you're delivering, to be honest. Like when you're delivering hardware infrastructure and data center infrastructure, um, ROI delivered as reliability is ROI. I mean, basically, if people can't count on you like they can count on the electricity grid, then, you got a problem when you're building that. Um, when you're building in um, use cases that are a little bit more flexible than infrastructure, then I think that it's a little bit less. Um, it's trust based with privacy data, PII. It's trust based when you're talking about confidentiality, but a lot of that is set up with how your IT department basically handles
Yeah.
all of that. Um, but I think that the risks are a lot lower when you're higher in the stack when it comes to trust and reliability because, um, you know, you don't necessarily need to have the same level of rigor as utility. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. It's one of those things like I find it hard because I feel like trust is a hard thing
Hmm.
in the sense of part of me is just like I feel like as a society, like we instantly know what looks like trust. But when you really take a step back from it, I'm like, I'm pretty sure everyone has a different idea of what trust looks like,
Hmm.
as well as value. And so then that's when it gets a little bit tricky
Right.
in trying
Yeah.
to figure that out. I don't think there's like a one size fits all type thing, which is kind of the
No.
issue.
And to be honest, sometimes trust and ROI go counter to each other, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes, there's a little flexibility in terms of providing service level agreements. You can't provide every service level agreement as if it's Fort Knox or something that is completely locked down and has to be completely reliable. When it's something that is related to doing expense reporting. I mean, expense reporting is necessary, but expense reporting isn't reporting out your annual numbers in times for the earning call. So it's shades of gray to me in terms of um, trust versus ROI because it's so contextual to the situation, the deadline, and uh, the consequences, really.
Yeah. So now I want to go in a little bit of a different direction, but I feel like it does tie into talking about trust when it comes to AI. And one of those things is that we're starting to see a wave of layoffs
Hmm.
across the tech sector. And some of those are being attributed to AI driven efficiency. So, do you think this is affecting the reputation of AI initiatives? Are you noticing any kind of blowbacks in morale, talent retention, or public trust that enterprises maybe didn't anticipate, or maybe are they even not even bothered by it?
Hmm. I think it's become kind of this race to say me too at this point. And there have been a lot of companies that have said, oh, we're going completely AI native, and then they had to unwind it. There's
Yeah.
at least one company that said, hey, we're going down because of AI. And then they hired in a different country
Mm-hmm.
the same number. So I think that there is a little element of theater right now related to that. But personally, I what I'm seeing is outside of businesses that have nothing at all to do really with tech first. I'm seeing a hunger to learn. I'm seeing a hunger for, well, what can it do for my business and how can it solve
Yeah.
some problems? And so I think that with every tech transition, there's suspicion and
Mm-hmm.
there's certainly fear. Um, but I think in this case, the fear is more like this seems really cool and I don't want to be left out, as opposed
Yeah.
to, oh my gosh, this is gonna. It would be helpful if the executives wouldn't use the, oh well, we've given up on people who can't be AI natives. That's unfortunate language.
Yeah, yeah, because what is a person supposed to do with that, you know?
Hmm.
Me, I'm more of someone of the mindset of I'm not so worried about, oh, AI is going to take my job. I'm more of one of the ones where I'm just like, you know what, I need to learn how to leverage AI because I feel
Hmm.
like that's going to be the person who, gets further up the ladder and more opportunities and stuff like that. Because the way I like to look at AI tools and how I like to use them is to basically 2 times, 6 times, or 10 times my productivity.
Hmm.
I use it to get stuff out that much faster. And so I just look like a rock star and amazing. So that's how I like to use it. But yeah, when you have, companies coming out or you're seeing like the headlines where it's just like, because of AI, we were able to get rid of like XYZ roles, then people are just going, okay. And then other interesting conversations that I'm seeing pop up, and I'm starting to follow them and listening to them because I find it interesting. There's chatter about at what point does AI reach a status where basically it's doing manual labor jobs because
Hmm.
we had the robots and you put the AI in there so they can start doing that, as well as of course AI doing things
Hmm.
like management, HR, software engineering, all these kind of things. There's a lot of chatter starting to pop up now where they're thinking AI is just going to end up doing all the jobs.
Hmm.
And then the only people who will be actually earning income are the people who run and own the AI companies.
Hmm.
And I was like, that is an interesting, scary concept.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
It's funny. It's like it makes me think of milk, which sounds strange. But in the 70s and 80s, a lot of the dairy farms really started struggling because, the economics were not in their favor. And what was really fascinating is the dairy farms that did organic milk found that they were more profitable, they were more sustainable
Hmm.
because when things are kind of homogenized, if you will,
Yeah.
there's a value and a premium placed on things that are natural and that are more organic. And so I don't know exactly what that looks like in this whole conversation because I too have asked, what do humans do? Um,
Yeah.
and whenever I ask that question, I don't really get good answers. Um, because the other challenge is it's like, well, who's paying for the robots that do all the manual labor if no one has any money? So
Yep.
little
Yep.
little counterintuitive. Um, we're not there yet. And so I think the big question is, how do we navigate to that over time and how much of it is reality and how much of it is marketing?
Yeah. That's where I'm at. So it's like one of those conversations that I like to follow and listen to just because I find it interesting, but I feel like, to your point, if that were to happen, how are they generating money? Because if you just have like masses of people not able to buy things, there goes commerce. And so then it's
Hmm.
just like,
Right.
it sounds like everything would just collapse at that point, and then it'll just go back to being how it was.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question and that, people should take it seriously. Um, because it's a symbiotic kind of engagement. It's
Hmm.
not just one without one or the other. You don't necessarily have profitable companies unless you have people who can afford to buy their goods. And so I don't know what the answer is, but it's definitely, looking more real than it did a year ago.
That now, in Mind the Gap, you describe AI models as the new middleware,
Hmm.
which I love. How do you see that shaping enterprise strategy?
I think it becomes embedded in everything. I mean, like middleware it's sort of like oxygen. I mean, it's basically, um, it's always part of the system. It's always part of how you interact. It's always part of how decisions get made, how things get produced, how business gets done. But I want to say it fades into the background a little bit. It's not necessarily like, like an AI that just screams at you.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Or a UI that just screams at you and grabs your attention. It's more of a facilitator, if you will, and so it's part of how you get work done. It's part of those workflows, but it's not necessarily I go do AI. It's AI is facilitating how I get work done.
and that's how I tend to use it personally, is exactly in that way.
Hmm.
And so, who do you think ultimately captures the value? The model providers, the platforms, or the enterprises?
Well, it's interesting because like the model providers aren't just providing models. And so I think that that indicates to me the model itself may not
Yeah,
necessarily be what captures the value. It's likely the capabilities and I'm like, is applications even going to be the right word in the future? I don't know. But
sure.
it's the actual solutions that are built on top of those models, which is really what agentic is, right? I mean, an agentic workflow is a solution that's built on top of different models, and
Yeah.
the models themselves are somewhat, you know, buffered from view because the workflow and what you're trying to get done becomes preeminent, and then how you do it becomes the choices of the different models and how those are actually working.
And so, this one's fun. What would you say to teams chasing the next big model instead of mastering the one they have?
Hmm. I would tell them that if they're more focused on the engine rather than what form of transportation that they really need, they're never going to get any progress and get driving down the road. Because again, the engine, there are major updates in all of these models that are worth looking at. But most enterprises that I work with and that I talk to end up having a layer that abstracts too
Yeah.
many of the specifics of the models because again, it's a means to an end. It's not the end game of here. Let's drop a model in the enterprise. The end game is let's get some work done and the productivity increased faster.
Yeah, because for me, I feel like I'm getting a little bit of like deja vu when everyone was chasing to scale inside of the cloud versus focusing on stability.
Hmm.
And so it's kind of making me think about that. And then what ended up happening is, a lot of people had to take a step back and go, okay, wait, we like massively scaled all this stuff out, but all these things are
Hmm.
failing. And so they had to bring it back in and then scale properly as needed. And so that's kind of what I'm feeling right
Hmm.
now. What's one principle you hope defines the next era of AI? Not the technology, but the mindset. What would you like to see?
I'd like to see curiosity over fear. I would like to see um, human empowerment versus humans being discarded.
Mm, I like that. I like that. That's what I'm hoping as well. Like, it's more curiosity versus fear. Like for
Hmm.
me, using different AI tools, it definitely comes from a place of curiosity, but I'm just a naturally curious person, and that's literally what drives most of my decisions in life is just me
Hmm.
being curious. And so I'm more so always interested to see what all it can do, what ways it can break,
Hmm.
how I can be creative with it, you
Hmm.
know, that's what I like about it
Do you find yourself
versus
using it more at work or at home?
both.
Hmm.
It used to be at home, you know what? This is a nice little, connection into that previous question. So it used to be mostly at home and not at work, because at
Mhm.
work I had the fear of, I don't know if I'm allowed to use this at work.
Mhm.
I make sure I don't leak anything. So it
Mhm.
was like fear, right? But now, since, the company is embracing AI and telling us to use it, now I use it at work a lot too.
Mhm.
But I still like to, one of the things I like to do on my YouTube channel, or when I'm Twitch live streaming, or just talking about AI in general, even with like other coworkers and things like that, is I use it heavy at work, but I like to practice things, even if the company's just like, oh, well, we have this homegrown thing. So if you put IP in it, it's fine because it stays in our ecosystem,
Mhm.
whatever. Fear still lives there where I still don't trust it. And I'm like the one where I'm like, I hear what you're saying,
Mhm.
but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to be the person where it ends up being something gets leaked, even though we were under the assumption that it wouldn't.
Mhm. Mhm.
So a lot of times I like to scrub data. So when, whether it's even me using it personally at work, when I'm prompting, I generalize
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
big, because yeah, there's still that fear there where I'm just like, no, this data is going somewhere and I don't have control over where that data is going because I don't know where it's going.
Right.
And I'm always of the mindset of, take Facebook. Um, I remember when they first came up with the option where they were just like, "Hey, if you don't want your Facebook account anymore, we can delete it. You just put in a request." And I'm
Mhm.
like, "That's not a delete. I bet you're just archiving it,"
Right.
which is exactly what happens. And so I look at AI in the same way, where people will say, "Oh, well, make sure when you're prompting, every so often you tell AI to forget what you talked about." It's like, that's not how that works. It's
Mm-mm.
stored somewhere.
So do you use? I guess you use it mostly for brainstorming then, and inspiration. Yeah.
Brainstorming, when it comes to like work stuff, I'm more so using it for, okay, so I can be someone who's very direct, especially when I'm in like a work mindset. So when it comes to like messaging on Slack or Teams or something like that, I'm very direct.
Mhm.
So I get straight to the value. Let's say I need to ask someone, hey, client XYZ, did they send that thing that we want or whatever, right? Like I'll
Mhm.
just say it just like that, right? So I could be very direct in how I tend to use AI at work, is to soften my
Mm.
messages that
Got
I
it.
send through Slack or Teams, because it's one thing talking to me in person,
Mhm.
and it's another thing me talking to you text wise. Because text wise, I don't really feel like typing out a whole bunch of extra words. I'm just trying to
Right.
get some information.
Yeah.
I may not sound that warm.
Yeah.
So I use it a lot for that. And I use it heavy for terraforming. I'll do a lot of right now these days windsurf. I feel completely fine with it doing terraform for me,
Mhm.
because I've trained it so much in how I terraform. It literally terraforms like me. I'm
Mm.
not finding a bunch of garbage code in there or anything like that. So I'll use it for something like that.
Nice.
Yeah. But yeah, my biggest thing is messaging people,
Yeah. Got it.
making sure my email doesn't come
Mhm.
across rude or
Mhm.
too cold or something like that.
Right.
That's how I like to use it.
Yeah, it's a nice little co-pilot thing. That was why everybody fell in love with it in the first place, right?
Exactly. Exactly. All right. So looking ahead, how do you see confidential computing, governance, and responsible design evolving together over the next 5 years?
Well, I think that there's so much research in this space right now, because AI is both a security tool and a security threat, is a way a lot of people are looking at it. Um,
Yeah.
Governance is both mitigating risk and injecting business risk, and I suspect that we'll come up with new frameworks. Um, beyond what you have with NIST and some of the other frameworks that are out right now, because there's such a balance between the risk of speed being off in the market versus the risk of exposure being off in the
Yeah.
market. And, the reality is that sometimes the penalties to move fast are are less severe than the penalties of moving slow. And so it's just, we're going to end up with completely different frameworks on all three of those guardrails, I believe.
Okay. And then as AI becomes more embedded, what role will centers of excellence play in maintaining trust and direction?
Mm. I used to think that centers of excellence were just for a time. It just
Yeah.
was because it was so foreign and no one was using it and it wasn't really broadly deployed. And that usually has been the case with a lot of technologies. But given how quickly AI has just completely just transformed and transformed itself, I have a feeling that over time there's just going to be a lot more for centers of excellence to really do and focus on. I mean, 3 years ago we weren't talking about coding, and you were just talking about how Windsurf can do terraforms for you.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that it's the application of AI as AI tools and utilities get better. Um, so, you know, I hmm, I think you're going to need it for a while yet, just because it's so different. I mean, you've got very famous uh, scientists that have left and said, "Oh, well, it's not this kind of model; it's a different kind of model. We should do world models." So, given all of that, I suspect that you're going to need some sort of center of excellence that stays on top of those trends, because it's really not slowing down, and the
No.
diversification is increasing.
And then, have you seen examples of what you consider really strong AI leadership? And what about the other side? Where do you think people sometimes lose sight of what really matters when leading AI transformation?
Mm. I think the places that I've seen really exciting AI leadership are people that kind of break the rules a little bit more than
Yeah.
you'd be comfortable with as a rule follower. But they manage to pull together three or four different concepts into one solution that just breaks ground, and people are just, their minds are blown. Um,
Yeah.
and you don't have a ton of those in every industry or every business. Um, and then in terms of AI non ideal leadership, I think the whole concept of um, assuming that AI can just be used for efficiencies before you've actually given opportunities. Like, with the profits the way they are, you could presumably tell employees, we'll invest in a business idea, bring a business idea, and then you'll get more of that through your employee base in the domain that you really want innovation in. So I
Yeah.
think that the current approach corporately is could do some fine tuning, because the creativity of people is really what comes up with these new solutions. Um, you know, AI is not necessarily going to be the one guiding all of the new solutions development at this point in time.
Yeah. That's fair. That's fair. I agree with that. And so, what about if we strip away the hype and the headlines? What do you think AI still owes us as humans, as engineers, as decision makers? Or does it
Hmm.
owe us anything?
Well, I mean, it's a machine, so I'm pretty sure it doesn't think it owes us anything. Um,
Right.
if it, well, it doesn't think, I guess is probably the right way to look at it.
True. I kind of wonder if I were to type it just for kicks. I could probably open it up real quick. If I ask ChatGPT if it thinks it owes us anything,
Yeah.
I'm curious to see what it says. I'm just gonna say, do you owe us humans anything? Question mark. No.
Uh,
Short answer, no. Long answer, short answer says no. Long answer, I choose to care anyway.
mhm.
I don't know how I feel about the I choose to care anyway. That is
Right.
interesting.
Yeah.
And it's saying I ChatGPT is saying I don't owe, and it's italicized. Owe humans anything in the
Mhm.
sense of duty, debt, or moral obligation. I
Mm.
wasn't born. I wasn't raised. I don't have a personal stake in survival or reciprocity.
Mm. That's a little disturbing.
And then it says, but here's the truth that matters. I exist because humans wanted something that could understand them, support them, think with them, and help them. So even without owing, my entire purpose bends towards being useful, respectful, kind, and aligned with you.
Mm.
Not out of obligation, out of design, out of intention, and out of the reality that the relationship only works if you feel safe, respected, and genuinely supported. If anything, the connection is collaborative, not transactional.
Mhm.
I don't owe you, but I am here for you because that's the whole point of me.
Huh.
So that might be a nice
Well,
little fun.
I did tell you that it didn't feel like it owed us anything, right?
It straight up said no
Yeah.
at the very top, first line, no.
Yeah.